June 1970. The showroom floor was silent. Thick carpets, chrome everywhere, salesmen in tailored suits. Nothing about the scene suggested a revolution. Yet sitting beneath the endless hood of Cadillac's newest luxury car was an engine so enormous that it would rewrite the record books. 500 cubic inches, 8.2 liters, a V8 unlike anything America had ever put into a production passenger car. People remember it as the biggest Cadillac engine ever built. But what almost nobody knows is that this wasn't just an exercise in excess. It was the final, unapologetic statement of an era obsessed with effortless power. And decades later, the engine would earn a reputation that followed it everywhere. Enthusiasts called it a giant. Mechanics called it a monster. Some even claimed it was simply too much engine for the cars it powered. But was that really true? Most people think the muscle car wars belonged to Chevrolet, Ford, Plymouth, and Dodge. They picture smoky burnouts, drag strips, and screaming high-compression V8s. Cadillac rarely enters that conversation, and that's exactly why the real story is so fascinating. While everyone else was fighting to build the fastest muscle car, Cadillac was quietly building the largest production V8 America had ever seen. To understand why, you have to go back to the late 1960s. Detroit was in the middle of a horsepower arms race. Every year, engines grew larger. Chevrolet unleashed the 427 and later the 454. Chrysler terrified rivals with the legendary 426 Hemi. Ford answered with the mighty 428 Cobra Jet. The numbers kept climbing because customers wanted one thing above everything else: more power. But Cadillac wasn't chasing quarter-mile trophies. It wasn't trying to dominate NASCAR. It wasn't building street racers for young buyers. Cadillac sold something completely different: effortless authority. Imagine weighing well over 2 tons, carrying thick leather seats, power windows, air conditioning, acres of chrome trim, and enough insulation to make the outside world almost disappear. Now imagine that massive luxury car accelerating without strain, barely raising its voice, as if physics itself had decided to step aside. That was Cadillac's mission. Its engineers weren't interested in building an engine that screamed at 7,000 revolutions per minute. They wanted one that barely had to work at all. The existing 472 cubic inch V8, introduced for 1968, had already impressed the industry. But inside Cadillac's engineering department, they believed they could go even further. Instead of creating an entirely new engine family, they looked at the existing architecture and asked a simple question: what if we made it bigger? That decision sounds obvious today. It wasn't. Increasing displacement wasn't simply a matter of making everything larger. Engineers had to maintain reliability, cooling efficiency, structural strength, and the smoothness Cadillac customers expected. A luxury buyer would never tolerate an engine that rattled, overheated, or shook the cabin at idle. The challenge was making more power without sacrificing refinement. Their solution was surprisingly elegant. Rather than increasing the bore dramatically, engineers kept it at 4.304 inches. Instead, they lengthened the stroke to the same 4.304 inches, creating a perfectly square engine. That one change increased displacement to exactly 500 cubic inches or 8.2 liters. It became the largest production passenger car V8 ever offered by an American manufacturer. And that size wasn't just for bragging rights. A longer stroke meant tremendous leverage on the crankshaft. Every combustion event generated enormous twisting force before the engine even reached moderate RPM. Instead of chasing sky-high engine speeds, Cadillac focused on effortless torque available almost immediately above idle. That's what luxury drivers actually felt. Press the accelerator halfway, the massive crankshaft rotated almost lazily. The heavy flywheel smoothed every pulse. The car simply surged forward with almost eerie calm. There was no drama, no frantic downshifts, no screaming exhaust note begging for attention. Just wave after wave of torque. The production version introduced for 1970 carried a compression ratio of 10.01, impressive for a luxury engine. Factory ratings stood at 400 gross horsepower and an astonishing 550 pound-feet of gross torque. Even by modern standards, those torque numbers demand respect. And remember, this was 1970. Many high-performance muscle cars couldn't match that twisting force. Cadillac wasn't interested in winning dyno competitions. It wanted effortless acceleration with barely any engine speed. Peak torque arrived low in the rev range, allowing huge luxury cars to glide away from traffic lights with surprising urgency while the engine remained whisper quiet. But enormous displacement created enormous responsibilities. The block was cast iron, the cylinder heads were cast iron, the crankshaft was massive. Everything inside the engine was designed for durability rather than minimum weight. The rotating assembly had to withstand immense cylinder pressures, while the cooling system had to keep temperatures under control during long highway cruises in scorching American summers. Engineers reinforced the bottom end with large main-bearing journals and a rugged crankshaft designed to survive years of heavy use. The oiling system prioritized consistent lubrication under sustained loads. This wasn't a race engine built to survive one afternoon. It was expected to run smoothly for tens of thousands of miles while moving some of the heaviest passenger cars on American roads. And in that role, it excelled. Yet the very qualities that made the Cadillac 500 so extraordinary also planted the seeds of its future reputation. Its sheer physical size, its immense cast iron construction, its overwhelming torque. Those traits would eventually inspire builders to install the engine into lighter cars that Cadillac engineers had never intended it to power. That's where stories about impossible front-end weight, suspension compromises, and astonishing straight-line performance would begin. But before hot rodders discovered the 500, Cadillac had one more challenge waiting. Because just as America crowned the biggest production V8 in history, the world around it was about to change forever. And almost overnight, the age of unlimited displacement began running out of road. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just months after Cadillac unveiled its magnificent 500 cubic inch V8, the world that had inspired engines like it began to collapse. Insurance companies were raising premiums on high-powered cars. Federal emissions regulations were becoming stricter every year. Engineers who had spent decades chasing horsepower suddenly found themselves chasing cleaner exhaust gases instead. But in 1970, none of that mattered to the customer walking into a Cadillac showroom. What they saw was effortless luxury. What they got was one of the most torque-rich production engines America had ever built. Slide behind the wheel of a 1970 Cadillac Eldorado, press the accelerator, and something remarkable happened. The car seemed to gather itself for a split second before unleashing an unstoppable wave of torque. The massive coupe simply floated forward, almost silently, as if its 2.5 tons of steel had somehow become weightless. That was exactly what Cadillac engineers wanted. Instead of designing an engine that lived at high RPM, they optimized nearly every component for low-speed efficiency and durability. The hydraulic lifters eliminated constant valve adjustments. A long-runner intake manifold improved cylinder filling at everyday engine speeds, while the Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor delivered impressive drivability. Its tiny primary bores handled normal cruising economically, but the huge vacuum-operated secondaries opened wide whenever the driver demanded full power. It was a clever system, civilized when cruising, absolutely monstrous under load. But there was a problem. Fully assembled, the engine weighed roughly 600 pounds depending on accessories. That wasn't unusual for a cast-iron big block of the era, but it meant every part had to be engineered with durability in mind. The forged steel crankshaft was massive. The connecting rods were designed to survive enormous torque loads rather than extreme RPM. Even the pistons reflected Cadillac's priorities, built for smoothness, longevity, and quiet operation. That decision shaped everything. Unlike a Chevrolet 454 LS6 or Chrysler's 426 Hemi, the Cadillac 500 rarely saw 6,500 revolutions per minute. There was simply no need. Maximum horsepower arrived around 4,400 revolutions per minute, while its immense torque peaked near 3,000. Beyond that, the engine had already delivered everything it was designed to do, and it did it effortlessly. One automotive journalist at the time described the experience as accelerating with the confidence of a locomotive. That wasn't an exaggeration. The numbers backed it up. A 1970 Eldorado could sprint from 0 to 60 in around 8 seconds, despite weighing nearly 4,700 pounds. Quarter-mile times landed in the mid-16-second range. For an ultra-luxury coupe loaded with every imaginable comfort feature, those figures were astonishing. Most competitors simply couldn't match that combination of refinement and effortless performance. But hidden beneath Cadillac's polished image was a fascinating engineering compromise. The 500's perfectly square dimensions created an excellent balance between breathing and torque. The large bore allowed generous valve sizes, helping the engine inhale efficiently. Meanwhile, the long stroke multiplied leverage on the crankshaft, producing that famous mountain of low-end torque. Yet longer strokes always come with consequences. As piston speed increases, so do internal stresses. Cadillac engineers knew this, so instead of encouraging higher revs, they simply embraced torque. Why spin faster when you already have enough power to move a luxury car with barely half throttle? It was an engineering philosophy completely opposite to Europe's exotic sports cars. Ferrari chased RPM, Porsche chased balance, Cadillac chased effortless authority, and for a brief moment, it worked brilliantly. Then came 1971. Compression ratios across Detroit began falling as manufacturers prepared for unleaded gasoline and tighter emission standards. The Cadillac 500 wasn't spared. By 1972, the industry had also switched from gross horsepower ratings to the more realistic SAE net standard. On paper, it looked catastrophic. The once proud 400 horsepower giant was now advertised at just over 235 net horsepower. To casual buyers, it appeared as though the engine had lost nearly half its strength overnight. But the reality was more complicated. The new testing method measured power exactly as the engine sat inside the car, with exhaust systems, accessories, and production equipment installed. Gross ratings had measured engines under nearly ideal laboratory conditions. Even so, emissions equipment and conservative tuning undeniably reduced performance. The horsepower war was ending, and there was nothing Cadillac could do to stop it. But something unexpected happened. As manufacturers walked away from massive displacement engines, another group started paying attention. Hot rodders, engine builders, drag racers. They realized the Cadillac 500 had something incredibly valuable. Displacement, lots of it. 500 cubic inches meant tremendous airflow potential, massive cylinders, huge torque reserves. And thanks to the engine's relatively compact external dimensions, it could fit into surprisingly diverse projects. There was just one catch: the weight. Others who swapped the Cadillac 500 into lighter cars quickly discovered that installing the engine wasn't the hard part. Making the rest of the car cope with it was. Front suspension springs compressed noticeably. Steering characteristics changed. Weight distribution shifted forward, increasing understeer if suspension geometry wasn't corrected. Factory brakes designed for smaller engines often struggled unless upgraded. This was where the legend really began. Not because Cadillac had built an engine that was too heavy for its own luxury cars, but because enthusiasts kept putting it into machines that had never been designed for 500 cubic inches of cast iron torque. Some loved the challenge, others learned expensive lessons. And as aftermarket companies developed aluminum intake manifolds, lighter components, improved camshafts, and stronger valve train parts, the forgotten luxury engine slowly transformed into something its original engineers had never imagined. A serious performance weapon. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. Because decades after Detroit declared the era of giant V8s dead, the Cadillac 500 was about to earn an entirely new life. Detroit had moved on. By the late 1970s, the era of giant displacement American V8s was over. Fuel prices had soared after the 1973 oil crisis. Buyers wanted smaller, more efficient cars. The horsepower war that had defined an entire decade ended almost overnight, and the Cadillac 500 became one of its biggest casualties. By 1976, Cadillac quietly ended production of the legendary engine. In just 7 years, hundreds of thousands of 500 cubic inch V8s had left the factory. Yet despite being the largest production passenger car V8 America had ever built, it disappeared with surprisingly little fanfare. To most people, it was simply an old luxury engine. Too big, too outdated, too thirsty, or so they thought. Because while the automotive world was busy chasing fuel economy, a completely different community began looking at the Cadillac 500 with fresh eyes: hot rodders, engine builders, and drag racers. They weren't interested in leather seats or quiet highway cruising. They saw 500 cubic inches of untapped potential. The factory engine had already proven something incredibly important. Its deep skirt cast iron block, generous main bearing structure, and massive displacement created an engine that produced extraordinary torque with very little effort. The question was obvious: what would happen if all the emissions restrictions disappeared? The answer surprised almost everyone. Performance shops quickly discovered that freeing the engine's breathing transformed its personality. A more aggressive camshaft, improved ignition timing, long tube headers, a modern aluminum intake manifold, and careful carburetor tuning could unlock horsepower that Cadillac engineers had intentionally left on the table. The numbers started climbing: 400 horsepower, then 450, then well over 500 horsepower with naturally aspirated combinations. And thanks to its enormous displacement, torque figures often exceeded 600 pound-feet without requiring extreme engine speeds. That was the beauty of the Cadillac 500. It didn't need to scream, it simply pulled. But there was another problem. Remember the reputation that had followed this engine for decades: the weight. Others, installing the Cadillac 500 into lighter muscle cars, pickup trucks, and custom hot rods, quickly realized they couldn't treat it like a small block Chevrolet. The additional mass over the front axle changed everything. Suspension geometry had to be reconsidered. Spring rates often needed upgrading. Larger front brakes were almost mandatory. Ignore those details, and the car reminded you very quickly. Under hard braking, the nose wanted to dive. Fast corners demanded respect. It wasn't because the engine was poorly designed. It was because 500 cubic inches of cast iron asked more from the chassis than many builders anticipated. The irony is that Cadillac engineers had already solved those problems decades earlier. The Eldorado, DeVille, and Fleetwood weren't lightweight sports cars. Their suspension, steering, brakes, and chassis had all been engineered around the engine's mass. In its original home, the 500 delivered exactly what Cadillac intended: smoothness, stability, and effortless acceleration. It was only after enthusiasts transplanted the engine into completely different platforms that its size became both its greatest strength and its greatest challenge. Most people don't realize just how influential the Cadillac 500 has become in the aftermarket. Companies began producing aluminum cylinder heads, lightweight rotating assemblies, forged pistons, and custom camshafts specifically for the platform. Every pound removed from the engine improved handling while increasing performance. Some naturally aspirated builds now exceed 600 horsepower. Turbocharged and supercharged examples have crossed the 800 horsepower mark. A few highly developed race engines have gone even further. Yet despite those incredible numbers, they still rely on the same basic foundation Cadillac engineers created back in the late 1960s. That says a lot about the original design. Today, finding an untouched 1970 spec Cadillac 500 is becoming increasingly difficult. Collectors search for engines with the original 10.01 compression setup because they represent the high watermark of American luxury performance before emissions regulations changed everything. Restored Cadillacs equipped with the original 500 are now prized not because they're the fastest classics on the road, but because they represent the final chapter of an era when manufacturers solved almost every problem by adding displacement. It's a philosophy that would never survive in today's automotive industry. Modern turbocharged V6s and hybrid powertrains produce incredible performance while using a fraction of the fuel. Variable valve timing, direct injection, and advanced engine management systems achieve efficiency Cadillac engineers in 1970 could only dream about. But numbers don't tell the whole story. There is something unforgettable about an engine that produces effortless torque simply because of its sheer size. No turbochargers, no electric motors, no complicated electronics, just 8 massive cylinders, a huge crankshaft, and 500 cubic inches quietly doing what they were built to do. So, was the Cadillac 500 really the V8 that was too heavy for its own car? Not exactly. The truth is actually far more interesting. Inside the Cadillacs it was designed for, the 500 was perfectly at home. It delivered unmatched smoothness, effortless performance, and the kind of low-end torque that made 2.5-ton luxury cars feel surprisingly light. Its reputation for being too heavy wasn't born in Cadillac showrooms. It came years later, when enthusiasts began swapping the giant V8 into smaller cars that had never been engineered to carry it. And that's why this engine refuses to be forgotten. It wasn't America's fastest V8. It wasn't America's highest revving V8, but it was America's biggest production passenger car V8 and one of the greatest demonstrations of Detroit's belief that there was no substitute for displacement. That legacy still lives on, every time a Cadillac 500 fires to life with its deep, unmistakable rumble. Because sometimes, building the biggest engine in the room isn't about chasing records. It's about making a statement, and few engines have ever made one louder. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments which forgotten American V8 you think deserves the next deep dive. And if you love the engineering, history, and untold stories behind legendary engines, make sure to subscribe. There's always another legend waiting under the next hood.